All right, I think we should start. Well, welcome everybody. This is the Q&A session for chapter 1, the validity chapter of the standards. We have Professor Suzanne Lane as the invited expert. Thank you very much, Professor Lane, for being available for this instance. I would like to introduce Professor Lane a little bit. Professor Lane is a professor in the University of Pittsburgh. She has a terrific CV and track record. She was ex-president of NCME. She was vice president of Division D at ARA. She participated as a member of the Joint Committee for reviewing the standards in the 99 version. The process was during the 90s. And also Professor Lane participated in the Management Committee, if I wrote that well, for the current version of the standards. Professor Lane has participated in many editorial boards of journals, very prestigious journals like JEM, Applied Measurement in Education, Educational Assessment, Educational Measurement Issues and Practice, among others. She has participated in the technical advisory of many companies and states too. Professor Lane, she is currently working in the validity chapter for the new version of the book Educational Measurement, which is like, that's big. I mean, she's also writing a chapter in the encyclopedia. I can remember now yeah, anyway. And I like this paper a lot from Professor Lane, Validity Evidence Based on Testing Consequences. That's one of many other super interesting papers that Professor Lane had written. So, I mean, Professor Lane, this is so good that we can have you here and that you are available for respond the question that we had during our discussion session about the validity chapter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio, for inviting me, and I look forward to interacting with all of you in this session. Thank you so much.
All right, so let's start. I shared with Professor Lane a list of questions, the question that we put in the InVision board. We agreed at the beginning of this activity, we did a voting, and we decided that the logic for to decide on the question was to put likes on the questions and share the questions. What I did at the end was to share the questions in order with the number of likes that the question received. And I put the link, I will put that link again for people that just arrived, of the list of questions that I shared with Professor Lane. So in terms of outline for this session today, I was thinking to spend maximum 30 minutes responding those questions, and then having 25 minutes for interactions, follow-ups, and new questions that can arise from the initial part. So Professor Lane, I'm not sure if you have any preference to start responding to those questions. Eventually I can share in the screen the list of questions. I don't know.
Sure, it's fine if we start from the beginning and go down, or if there's preferences that individuals would like me to address, I'll try to do so.
Okay. And do you feel okay if you receive any short follow-up right now, or do you want to wait until the end?
No, the more interactive, I think, the better it is. So whenever you want to interrupt me, you can and ask questions. If something comes up, I'd be more than happy to make this as interactive as possible.
Okay, good. So in that case, for people that want to follow up, just jump in, and maximum 1 minute for each follow-up, please. So I will share my screen then, and share the list of questions. All right, so these are the first 3 questions that received more likes. Maybe we can start with this one. So that validity need to be reestablished over time. Assessment publishers provide evidence for validity at the launch of their assessment, but it's more validity evidence required throughout the life of the assessment.
Okay, it's a great question because sometimes individuals feel like once they've done the initial evidence, then it's completed. But I think what more test publishers and state assessments are doing are really providing a validity and hopefully a fairness argument that specifies the claims in terms of the score interpretations and uses, and then any assumptions underlying those claims. And then that provides a framework for thinking about the evidence that needs to be collected to support the claims for interpretations as well as uses, and then to support the claims with regard to any assumptions underlying them. So when you think of the multiple, like if you take a state assessment program, there's multiple claims for score interpretation and uses. Score interpretation, it might be reliable scores and valid score inferences regarding student achievement relative to the content standards. And this is for all students as well as subgroups of students. So you have to break that claim out, any assumptions underlying it, and then provide evidence for it. So another example for claims for uses, it might be teachers use information to support curricular and instructional planning at the individual level and at the classroom level. So clearly for this use claim, evidence is not going to be collected ahead of time. It's going to be, the individuals will need to collect it afterwards. And usually the use claims in educational testing are the claims that are least supported. So it's not only the test developer that needs to collect evidence to support validity, but also those who mandate tests. So if a state mandates a test, then evidence should be collected for not only interpretation claims, but use claims as well. So it's an ongoing process. And if you really think about a validity arguments, the claims, assumptions, and then evidence to support them, you're not going to, in most cases, be able to initially obtain all of the evidence. That you're going to have to wait and obtain evidence for the uses, as well as things like if a assessment program decides to start using new types of items, perhaps more constructed or technology enhanced items, and to slowly put that onto the existing tests, then evidence is going to be needed to support the use of those types of items, especially if they're supposed to be assessing higher level thinking skills, then response process evidence will be needed. So it's not a never ending process, but it is an ongoing process.
Thank you very much. Anybody wants to follow up or comment something? Yes, no? Don't be shy. Professor Lane is very nice.
That might not have been a satisfying answer to say that evidence is probably somewhat ongoing, but initially you're going to have priorities of the evidence to be collected, and some evidence just can't be collected initially. So you have to think about the priorities in terms of the claims that you're making about score interpretations and uses.
Professor Lane, but I have a follow-up on that, because I mean, I agree with you that this of course, validation is ongoing, but still you will be worried about the validation of future uses. So even if you do an evaluation of something that you use, how the test was interpreted and used in the past, that is relevant only if that that case makes sense for future uses. So yeah, I mean, and also I can see that there are some type of evidence that you can only have after you had like a full complete cycle, or I don't know, like using the test, but still, I think you should be proactive in general to gather evidence beforehand, right?
Right. I mean, you need to provide as much evidence ahead of time as possible before a test is operational. But there are cases in which you cannot, because such as the uses. And if it's used in a different way, then it's incumbent on the user to provide that evidence.
Right. Okay. All right.
Sorry, Sergio, you are muted.
Sorry. So validation is the joint responsibility. I will continue with the following question, sorry. Validation is the joint responsibility of the test developers and the test users. How can these parties cultivate a culture of rigor in different high-stake contexts, e.g. private and or state-sponsored testing, when it comes to getting decisions based on assessment right? In cases where conflict of interest arise, or disruptive validity evidence is uncovered, or even collusion between developers and users, where can external oversight come from, or is that necessary?
Another great question. You know, I live in the world of state assessments and K-TRUE testing. However, I have served on a number of advisory groups for credential testing. But in state assessments, we have the peer review process, which does provide some oversight. Now, it's not perfect, but there is such a process. And there are psychometricians that actually are involved in the peer review process for state assessments. And state assessments also have technical advisory committees. I believe, Neil, that all the states that I know of have technical advisory committees, and these usually consist of anywhere between 6 and 10 psychometricians. They have expertise in different areas, consist of experts in the assessment of students with disabilities and English learners. So in that way, these technical advisory committees, or TACs, review the work that is being done at the state assessment systems, and they provide recommendations. I'm currently serving on way too many state assessment TACs, but it is extremely enjoyable. And all the TACs that I've served on, the state assessment folks, as well as the contractors, really want to do their best. And the TAC serves as kind of an external review and provides recommendations. So I think that is very useful. There's also, when you think of not only that, but testing companies have technical advisory committees too, like ETS, Pearson, ACT. So while the technical advisory committees don't have the last say, they do provide recommendations for the work. And then assessment programs might have external independent individuals do some of the work. For example, alignment studies to determine the extent to which assessments are aligned to the content standards at the state level are done by an independent contractor. Standard setting is done by an independent contractor. So there is a degree of external work and review that's done for testing programs. I don't see overall like monitoring body, but I think that technical advisory committees do great work in trying to help reinforce what's good, change or try to change what could be improved.
All right. Anybody wants to follow up, comment on this response?
Yes, Dr. Lane, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the fact that the quality assurance process you just described is relatively opaque to downstream stakeholders like parents and students and those that are maybe most affected.
I agree with you. It is, a lot of people don't know about tax. And even if you go on state websites, you don't even see that information sometimes. So individuals might not be aware of it. Some state assessment or state departments actually within law have to have the tax meetings open to the public. And I've served on them where an individual or two will come in from the public, but most of them are not like that at all. So it might be, you know, a good idea for states and others to really kind of advertise, in essence, to indicate that there is some oversight in terms of technical advisory committees.
I have a question kind of going off of that. So in thinking about, we talked a lot in our previous meetings about users and their responsibility in collecting validity evidence. And so I'm thinking, you know, I think I work in some state testing, K through 12 testing too. And so I'm thinking about our users and how would they know when a use requires additional validity evidence? And are the users, those users, the people who mandate the test, is there a better way for them to have access to the tax as well? Just to kind of facilitate their collection of validity evidence?
Yeah, I mean, it might, when I think of who mandates the test, it's typically for a state test, it's the State Department. Well, it comes down from federal mandates, but it's the State Department. So the State Department does have tax. Now, for school districts, those that might be using different types of interim assessments, you know, there's a number of different ones out there. The ones that I am aware of also have technical advisory committees. Though there has been conversation that there is lack of transparency and validity evidence for these interim assessments, and teachers and schools use them as if there is evidence to support their use because they're not aware of it. So I think we as measurement specialists need to have stronger voices in trying to help ensure that there is such evidence to support their use. Because like you said, a school district that adopts something, they probably are not aware that they need to look at the technical manual to see if there's any evidence for how they're going to use it.
Yeah.
And probably larger school districts are at an advantage because they might have someone who knows something about assessment, but the rest of them probably don't.
Any other follow-up? I have one follow-up. So, okay, so technical advisory committees are there, but I'm not sure, I don't think the standard have any recommendation in that regard. I think those committees happen, but it's not that the standard are suggesting or encouraging that. I am
No,
correct.
I don't think the standards do. They encourage expert review for to provide content evidence and so forth. But I don't believe the standards provide any guidance with a technical advisory committee.
And is the standard the right place to put such a recommendation?
It could be. there could be, they could address that to some extent. To have some kind of oversight for different testing companies. But I have to admit, the testing companies that I've worked with really are strong, and there are issues sometimes, but they do have the kids, the mind, they are strong, they're diligent, they're responsible, and they want to do what's best.
Right. Yeah. But still, the standards are more directed for the ones that are not doing that well. I mean, that's
Right.
Yeah.
But we do have to remind, certain assessment programs to do certain things that are within the standards.
Right.
Like one of the things is response process evidence. That is a more difficult thing to do with focus groups, to find out if the tasks actually evoke the knowledge and skills that they're intended to do. But more and more states and testing programs are doing those types of think alouds.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any last comment, follow up? All right. Hold on, there is a question in the chat. I wonder about how measurement specialists can make their voices heard in terms of making sure users are aware of the presence or lack of validity arguments for their specific uses. How do measurement specialists know that users are trying to do something? How do users know that they should connect with measurement specialists? Could you read that question in the chat, Professor Lane?
You're right. Sometimes measurement specialists don't know, and it depends on the nature of the assessment. So for interim assessments, a lot of times we don't know how the users are using it and if they're using it appropriately. A lot of times there is lack of evidence for their use. So I think it's, if it is a state assessment system, or if it's within a state, there are some things that the state can do to try to ensure that there's proper usage. They can perhaps provide guidance on which interim assessments, for example, do provide validity evidence. They can provide guidance in terms of which ones perhaps are more aligned to their content standards. But it's difficult because there's so few measurement specialists and many more users of tests for measurement specialists to be able to reach all of the users. But there are different types. I know one school district in the South actually has a technical advisory committee, a large school district. That is very unusual. And there's a few individuals that serve on it that provide great guidance to that district. But somehow or other, we need to reach more districts than one. Challenge.
All right, let's move to the following questions. So, the following question: how can concerns around validity due to accountability requirements in public education be handled by the standards? I.e., if certain measures are reported because it is a hoop for states district to jump through to get federal funding, how can test developers run interference in this space?
Yeah, the standards do approach accountability in terms of thinking about that there's accountability at different levels, at the student, the teacher, the district, the school, the state level. And then also it does mention about there's different stakes associated with different accountability measures. In the past, there was a lot of high school graduation exit exams where students had to exit, and that's a high stakes accountability purpose of a test for individual students. So the standards, to me, they can't be prescriptive. They are just standards. And so I think they do highlight the important issues with accountability. The standards are not there to identify different indices, because when we think about an accountability index, it might have achievement status. It might include progress. It might include graduation rates. It could include attendance, the extent to which achievement gaps are decreased. So there's multiple things. And when we think about the information that can go into an accountability index, it's going to depend on who thinks what is important. So what do people value? There's different stakeholders that might value one thing over another. The emphasis, the extent to which the different pieces of information are weighed is value laden as well. Do we weigh achievement status versus progress more or less? So these decisions have to be made. And many, many states bring these accountability measures when they're beginning to define what an index is, what information goes into it, how are they going to weigh it, how are they going to actually have a statistical technique to measure it. So those sort of things are brought to tax. Some states have their own technical advisory committee for accountability. And states are pretty diligent in thinking about their accountability measures and what information goes into them. The CCSSO also is a great organization for states in many things, especially in accountability. The Center for Assessment that Rich Hill began, and Brian Gong was the director, now Scott Marion is the director, also works with states to try to implement them. So while the standards could probably have additional information on accountability, in general, I think they highlight the important aspects of accountability and different measures for it and what to think about. What are the important things to think about when designing accountability systems?
Great. Any follow-up comment? Yes, no. All right. We'll move then to the next question. Okay, so this is a follow-on question. What is your opinion about the recurrent expression in the chapter of interpretation for a specified use? That's an expression used.
I have a very strong opinion on this one. I think the standards offered a narrow view of validity, indicating that validity refers to score interpretations for proposed uses instead of validity referring to score interpretations for proposed uses as well as those uses. So I think the way in which they've interpreted validity and what validity refers to is rather narrow, because it does not really identify uses as part of the validity argument. And when I think of uses, and Sergio, you mentioned a paper I wrote on consequences. I did many studies a number of years ago looking at consequential evidence for the Maryland School Performance Assessment Program when it was before No Child Left Behind. And so when the standards disregard uses. In essence, they're not including consequences as part of the validity argument. And many like Cronbach, Messick, and Kane identify the importance of consequences in the validity argument. They do so in different ways and to different extent, but all three of those validity theorists thought consequences was part of the validity argument. And the standards fall short in saying that uses and consequences are part. Now, I do, because I served on the Joint Committee for the 1999 standards. The standards are not just made up, or the Joint Committee is not just made up of those individuals in educational testing. There's individuals in clinical testing, in psychological testing, in IO testing. So the committee is quite diverse, and sometimes diverse in their thinking and the values that they hold. So sometimes consensus might be challenging to achieve. So some things are not perhaps put in the standards that individuals might want, because it's a consensus document based on the Joint Committee.
Any follow-up on this question? Comment? No.
What are your opinions on how that is identified as validity for proposed test uses?
I have also a strong opinion, but I will let somebody else to speak first, please.
I always found it to be confusing and seems like wordsmithing, the result of horse trading to get to consensus you've described. I think is use included or not? I'm not clear.
Yeah, I think one of the recommendations probably for the next committee will be to make it explicit if uses are part of the validity argument, and if consequences are part of the validity argument. Because in fact, I think the 2014 standards went slightly backwards from the 1999 standards, because in the validity chapter in the 1999 standards, consequences was clearly part of the validity argument. When consequences is brought up in the validity chapter in the 2014 version, consequences are part of an argument, but validity was dropped from that discussion. So I've done a careful review, and a student and I actually had a presentation at NCME to discuss what happened to uses and consequences from 1999 to the 2014 version. And I think there's a step backwards in the 2014 version. And this is, I've got part of this in the validity chapter. And I should say the validity chapter for ed measurement, Scott Marion is my co-author on it.
Professor Lane, and in which NCME conference did you do that presentation you said?
Oh, it was a number of years ago. I can send you that paper, Sergio, and it will be up in the upcoming validity chapter as well, part of that.
Awesome. Yeah. I don't know. The wording that the standard has, it's so ambivalent for me, because on one side the standard is saying that validity is not a property of the test, but when the validity is tied to the interpretation, then if you have like a few interpretations that are kind of like the expected interpretation of the test, then validity is kind of like a multi-dimensional property of it. And if a test has only one expected interpretation, still validity is going to be a property of the test. So that thing, I don't know, I also don't like the wording, and I think it leaves like a lot of room for interpretation at the end, because if one single interpretation can be linked to many uses, then validity is getting closer to be a property of the test. If any use has a specific unique interpretation associated, then that might be different. And then there is like an acknowledgement of that any specific use has one specific interpretation, and then validity is kind of more wide. But that's not explained, that's not problematized in the standard. So it leaves so much room for different kind of readings of that expression. So yeah, I don't like it.
And I think in most testing situations, there can be multiple interpretations and multiple uses. So it's just so imperative that one develops a validity argument and identifies what are the intended claims, interpretation in terms of interpretations and uses. And that really does provide a framework for identifying what evidence needs to be collected and the priority of evidence as well. And I should say, again, we're talking about validity, but in the chapter, we argue that when you think of validity, we're also thinking of fairness, and fairness should be part of the validity argument if you're not going to have a separate fairness argument. Because when we're thinking about fairness and equity, we need to ensure that everything we do, from defining the construct to collecting information about the uses, is paying attention to the different subgroups within our population of interest. And when we think of in the past, when we define constructs, even mathematics achievement can mean something slightly different in one culture over another. And the way that it is measured can be slightly different. Just the way, in a simple arithmetic problem, the way in which that arithmetic problem is formatted can change. So we need to be really careful about when we're thinking about validity, we're thinking about it for all students, but we need to pay attention to it for different subgroups of students within our population.
All right, any other comment, follow-up? All right, let's move to the next question then. What were some past points of debate, if any, on how to incorporate ethics into issues of validity?
I don't know how many of you have read Messick's chapter on validity in the Ed Measurement or any of his papers, but Messick really brought ethics into play. He was basically talking about that when a test is used for a particular purpose, it raises the value in measurement. So it raises the issues of values in measurement, with test use being an ethical issue. So when we think of ethical issues, we think about like the moral principles that we bring to bear on our actions. So Messick really was a champion, and Cronbach, I should say, also discussed ethics, and Kane discussed ethics, but Messick's chapter really highlights it. And it goes back to some writings that he did in the 1960s when he talks about that whether to use a test for a particular purpose raises ethical issues. So whether to use a test for, let's say, for employment, or whether to use a test to help make decisions about selecting individuals into graduate school raises ethical issues. And it really, one needs to think about different stakeholders and their values and how their values are going to change, are going to be different. And one needs to consider the different stakeholders. And stakeholders, I also mean different cultural groups who are part of the testing environment.
Here at UMass, we have the validity class with Steve Ciresi, and he make us read the validity chapter from GSIC. And we have like very fond appreciation of that chapter because like we suffer it.
It's a strong, dense chapter, but there's so much good in it. It probably required a number of readings from me. And I still go back to it to think about some of the things that he has said. Now, one of the things that I disagree with Messick, he argued that consequences should be part of the validity argument. But for the most part, he argued it in terms of consequences should be part of the validity argument if negative consequences might be due to a flaw in the testing process, such as construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant variance. But many, like Kane, like Bob Lynn, argue, and myself and Steve, I believe, would argue that if tests are mandated to make changes in instruction and curricula, so tests are used as educational change agents, then consequences are extremely important, regardless if it's due to underrepresentation or construct irrelevant variance. That clearly should be looked at, but any consequences that could potentially be negative, unintended, should be looked at. For example, back in the days, I don't know if you've studied when minimum competency testing came into play, and that was in the 1980s. The goal was for states to develop tests to ensure that students had basic skills. And one of the consequences of that testing movement was that only basic skills were being taught and instructed on for students who were achieving poorly. In some cases, that was perhaps students living in economically disadvantaged area. So they were not instructed on higher level thinking skills. So that was a negative consequence of the minimum competency testing movement. And to me, that is part of the validity argument. Sorry, I went off in a tangent.
No, but that's great. Any wants to continue or respond to this?
Yeah, Dr. Lane, do you think that the standards kind of, and as they're currently written, adopt Messick's view that consequences should only be considered if they can be traced to a flaw in the test? I think that's kind of what standard 1.25 says, but I've always been unclear on that, and I wonder what your view is.
No, I believe that is the case. It's in the validity chapter. And they say that consequences is only important if it's due to construct irrelevant variance or construct underrepresentation. But again, they don't consider consequences as part of the validity argument. I believe when you go into the accountability chapter, it's either I forget which one, I should have looked at it, the educational testing or the accountability chapter, it does discuss the need to look at consequences if the tests are mandated and are used as educational change agents. So, but it's not in the validity chapter.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to the next question. In what ways do you think the standards could be made more user-friendly for a novice?
Oh boy, did we sit around when we were revising the 1999 standards and discussion. And I think both the 1999 and the 2014 joint committees thought about this, and ideas came up about, and I think both committees thought about having some case uses. So to have a separate document so that you would have some cases, and then you could show how the standards could be applied to those cases. But they never came to realization. And I remember NCME tried to do something like that a number of years ago, and just trying to ensure that you've got enough context around the use cases. Ensuring that you've got agreement is very difficult. So it would be nice if they did have some use cases, but it's difficult to do. It would be nice to do it in a particular area, like in educational testing or state testing, and that could be achieved. Now, some of the states, though, are developing technical reports that really are excellent. They've come such a long way where they're laying out validity arguments and the claims and the assumptions and the evidence that needs to support it, and identifying when they have sufficient evidence and when they don't have sufficient evidence. So some of the state technical reports are excellent in doing that. And I think we're going to see more of that. Another framework, in addition to the standards, is to think about Kane's framework in thinking about the scoring inferences, the generalization inference, the extrapolation inference, and the decision use inference, and laying those out as well. To think about what evidence needs to be collected and to provide a more concrete example.
Any response? Any follow-up here? Remembering
So,
sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. So I was thinking about, I think that's awesome, you know, that there's documentation out there that's so good, and I understand that it's difficult to create that for the standards, but I don't know if there's a way to connect those resources either with the document, the standards document, or something on the web that would say this is a good example of this. I don't know, that would maybe connect those without it being part of the standards.
Yeah, and because a lot of, like, I'm thinking of a couple of the technical reports I've seen recently that really for states that really lay out the validity argument. And they do actually cite the standards. And most technical reports, you know, some of them do a great job and some of them do not as good of a job in terms of laying out a validity argument. But typically they do identify the standards, or at least the type of evidence that's being collected, whether it be response process evidence or content evidence, and go into great detail what type within that particular category, the evidence to be collected.
But still, I think there is something about the format of the standards that may need some review, because currently a standard is understood as a fixed document, and now we have so much technology available to make it more dynamic and don't need to wait like 15 years like to have some changes or updates or enriching the document.
Right. And when you think of it, you know, the standards provide these 5 areas of evidence, that there's other types of evidence as well. There's like evidence related to test administration, right? Because the way in which tests are administered can provide validity evidence, or their test security also is an area where evidence can be collected to support the validity of score inferences and uses. So the standards could become even broader in thinking about the types of evidence.
All right, any other comment? All right, so let's move to this following question. From this chapter, propositions play a dominant role in the process to support the proposed interpretation. How can we make sets of reasonable and persuasive propositions to prove a test is validated or not? Is it possible for us to see a real example?
Yeah, when I think of propositions, I guess I don't use that terminology. I like to think about it in terms of the validity argument, claims, and assumptions. If you, I can show you part of a table that we have in our new validity chapter where we've laid out a general IUA and validity argument for culturally responsive assessments. If you can share your screen.
Yeah, let me give you the powers to do that.
I don't know if you wanted me to literally show you something now, but I can just put it up.
I mean, that would be great. Yeah. All right.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this comes, I hope this is addressing what you're said. Scott and I have a section on assessments that are more culturally responsive and sustainable. And so we were thinking about what type of inferences are important. And we borrowed Kane's framework, but I've developed this performance inference where we think about inferring from the task to the performance. So like what is going on between the task and how the student is performing? And then one of the warrants is the task elicits intended knowledge and skills for all examinees. And then these are some of the assumptions based on that warrant. The defined construct is relevant for different cultural groups. The knowledge, skills, and abilities selected to be assessed are culturally relevant, and so on. And then you can see in this column is the backing or the evidence to support this particular inference. So this gives you an idea of perhaps being more concrete in thinking about the different types of inferences we want to make, and then the evidence to support it. And so as you can see, some of this evidence is reflecting the different types of evidence proposed by the standards. Now, we could get more explicit in identifying, where is the response process evidence, where is the content evidence, etc. A lot of this has to do with response process evidence because we're making an inference from the task to the performance. And then if we go down here, this is Kane's scoring inference, where we're inferring from the performance to the score. And so the scoring rule that assigns a score to the test performance reflect the knowledge, skills, and ability for all examinees. And you can see the different assumptions underlying it, and then the types of evidence. So this is only just a partial, and it goes on to the generalization, the extrapolation, and the use. Now, if you let me, this is only a partial way of thinking about the evidence for more culturally responsive assessments. But others, like Chappelle, has developed a validity argument similar to this, but for assessing students, English learners, and that would be a good document to look at. And Kane and his colleagues have done a validity argument for that provides these concrete examples for certification testing. So there's examples of these types of validity arguments and then the evidence to select them.
This is awesome. Thank you very much, Professor Lane, for.
I'll stop sharing.
That was great. Any follow-up on this?
So on that, it's a little off topic, but on that chart, there was rubrics and scoring reflecting different ways of knowing and different ways of demonstrating knowledge. But you don't typically see, I've done a lot of work with state tests as well, and you don't typically see a lot of that. It's usually just kind of a 1 point for this algorithm or this procedure, and then that's the whole rubric for scoring the open-ended responses. So how do we do more to actually make it so it is more equitable and more open like that?
Yeah, I think we need to include people from different groups in our assessment process. I mean, test developers do have, sensitivity training and bias training for item development, as well as a review afterwards. But I think we need to provide examples too when we think about scoring rubrics to make sure the criteria is allowing for different ways of knowing and representing the knowledge, if possible, if it doesn't go against the standard. And then to have examples of student responses that show this. Now, in formative assessment, it's much more easier to do that because you can be much more on the fly on essence with formative assessments. And there is work being done in that area. I know that Jennifer Randall from the University of Massachusetts is working in that area, and she has thinking about instruction as well as assessment. So it's easier to do with formative assessments than a standardized assessments, but I think we can be better at it to ensure that we're attending to different cultures.
All right, we are on time now. So thank you very much, Professor Lane, for all your responses. This was super insightful and great. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate all your questions and comments, and feel free to follow up with me. My email is sl@pitt.edu. Very easy. My initials @pitt.edu. And thank you. And Sergio, wonderful sessions. I wish you the best. I know that you have excellent people coming up. So good luck with it and enjoy.
Thank you very much. Well, so I will stop the recording now, and yeah, we're going to continue.